Somewhere in a filing cabinet inside Shell's headquarters in 1986, there was a document, nearly 100 pages long, stamped confidential in red ink, written by Shell's own scientists, for Shell's own executives, describing in precise technical detail exactly what would happen to the planet if Shell kept doing what Shell was doing. The document predicted destructive floods, the forced abandonment of entire countries, mass human migration on a scale never seen in recorded history. Climate changes, it said, that would be, and this is a direct quote from Shell's own internal report, the greatest in recorded history. Shell's executives read it. Shell's board was briefed on it. And then Shell spent the next 4 decades doing everything in its power to make sure you never found out it existed. That document was not uncovered until 2018 by a Dutch journalist named Jelmer Mammers, digging through archives nobody was supposed to find. 32 years after Shell's own scientists had written it. Long enough for an entire generation of children born in 1986 to grow up, have children of their own, and begin watching the floods and fires and heat waves that Shell's scientists had predicted arrive, exactly as predicted, while Shell's executives told the public there was nothing to worry about. This is the story of the most successful cover-up in corporate history. To understand how complete the deception was, you need to understand how early it started. Shell's internal interest in climate change did not begin in 1986. It began in 1962. That year, Shell's chief geologist, a man named Marion King Hubbard, produced a book-length report for the U.S. National Academy of Sciences that explicitly warned about the risks of human-induced global warming on the Earth's weather systems and ecological balances. Shell had a scientist warning about climate change before the Beatles released their first album. By 1981, Shell had established a formal internal climate science program, the Greenhouse Effect Working Group, 5 years before the United Nations even created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the body that would eventually become the world's authority on climate science. Shell was not behind the science. Shell was ahead of it, and the company had the documents to prove it. In 1985, an internal Shell report titled Why and How to Control Energy Pollution warned of major adverse changes from climate pollution, including the melting of ice caps and significant changes to climatic patterns worldwide. In 1986, the full internal report, the 100-page confidential document, warned that the potential changes would impact human environments, future living standards, food supplies, and could have consequences. In Shell's own words, that would be the greatest in human history. In 1988, Shell's researchers wrote in an internal briefing, with the very long timescales involved, it would be tempting for society to wait until the evidence becomes overwhelming before doing anything. The potential implications for the world are, however, so large that policy options need to be considered much earlier. And the energy industry needs to consider how it should play its part. Otherwise, it could be too late to take effective countermeasures to reduce the effects or even to stabilize the situation. Read that again. Shell's own scientists, in 1988, writing internally to Shell's own management, saying that by the time the evidence of climate change becomes obvious to the public, it will be too late to stop it. That is not ambiguity. That is not scientific uncertainty. That is Shell's internal research team telling Shell's board, with complete clarity, exactly what was coming and exactly what the window for action looked like. And what did Shell do with that information? In 1989, 1 year after that internal warning was written, Shell joined the Global Climate Coalition, a US-based lobby group formed by the major oil companies, explicitly designed to cast doubt on climate science and oppose government action on emissions. Shell did not join reluctantly. Shell was a founding participant. The same company whose internal scientists had just written that it might already be too late to act, was simultaneously paying membership dues to an organization whose entire purpose was to tell the public there was nothing to act on. The Global Climate Coalition spent the next decade attacking the scientific consensus on climate change, undermining the credibility of climate researchers, and lobbying governments worldwide to avoid binding emissions commitments. Shell remained a member until 1998, not because Shell had a change of heart, because by 1998, The scientific evidence had become so overwhelming that membership in the GCC had become a public relations liability. Shell did not leave because it was wrong to deceive the public. Shell left because it was no longer cost-effective. Even after leaving the GCC, Shell remained a member of the American Petroleum Institute, which ran its own climate misinformation campaign through the early 2000s. Even after Shell's own 1998 internal scenario planning document, codenamed TINA, There Is No Alternative, had imagined a future in which violent storms hit the U.S. East Coast in 2010 and class action lawsuits were filed against oil companies based on what they knew and when they knew it. Shell's internal planners in 1998 had already wargamed the legal and reputational consequences of the cover-up. They had already modeled the scenario where the public found out, and they kept going anyway. Now walk through what that decision cost. The 1986 report warned specifically about rising sea levels, ocean acidification, and forced human migration. Those predictions were not vague projections. They were specific, technical, quantified estimates of what a continued trajectory of fossil fuel emissions would produce. Every major climate event of the last 20 years, the accelerating Arctic ice melt, the intensification of Atlantic hurricane seasons, the flooding of coastal cities, the displacement of populations across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, falls within the range of outcomes that Shell's own scientists described in a confidential document that was locked in a filing cabinet for 32 years. The people who experienced those events did not know that one of the companies most responsible for causing them had the scientific evidence in their possession decades earlier. They did not know that while their homes were flooding, while their crops were failing, while their governments were spending emergency funds on disaster response, Shell executives were sitting in boardrooms that had been briefed, in writing, that this was coming. The 1988 internal briefing said the energy industry needed to consider how it should play its part. Shell considered it. Shell decided the answer was profit. And then Shell hired lobbyists to make sure nobody else found out what the question had been. In 2021, a Dutch court ordered Shell to cut its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030, the first time a corporation had been legally compelled to reduce emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. Shell appealed. In 2024, a Dutch appeals court overturned the ruling on technical grounds, finding that the specific 45% target could not be imposed by a court. Shell celebrated the decision. The same year, Shell CEO announced plans to cut spending on its renewables division because the profit margins were thinner than oil. The company, whose own scientists had warned in 1988 that it might already be too late, was in 2024 reducing investment in the only technologies that could change the trajectory, not because the science had changed, because the quarterly earnings report demanded it. The 1986 document is not ancient history. It is a chain of custody, a paper trail that connects a decision made in a boardroom 40 years ago to every climate event unfolding right now. Shell knew. Shell's scientists wrote it down. Shell's executives read it. Shell's lawyers buried it. And when a Dutch journalist finally dug it out of the archive in 2018, the company that had predicted the greatest changes in human history responded with a press statement about its commitment to a sustainable energy future. The risk, the suits will be based, the document says, on what they knew when. Shell's own lawyers, in 1998, had already identified the exact legal theory that would one day be used against them. They had already written the prosecution's argument into an internal planning document, and they kept going for another 26 years. The question that document raises is not whether Shell knew. The documents settle that. The question is what the rest of us do with the knowledge that they knew. Because the floods that Shell scientists predicted in 1986 are not coming. They are here. The migrations they described are underway. The food supply disruptions they modeled are already visible in the data. The world that Shell's 100-page confidential report described, the world with changes greater than any in recorded history, is the world we are living in right now. Shell's scientists wrote the forecast. Shell's executives buried it. And the bill, as always, is being paid by everyone else. Hit subscribe. We follow the oil. All the way to the document they didn't want you to find.